They dragged her through the dust like a dying animal. Clara Mayfield was only 22, but her face was already a ruin. A fist had broken the delicate line of her cheekbone. Her lips were split and caked with blood. Her shoulders, torn and bleeding from where they'd ripped her dress, screamed with pain. The men of Deadwood Ridge cursed her name, their voices thick with hate, calling her a devil, a witch, a disease. The women, the ones who'd once shared a smile with her at the general store, now spat on the ground as she passed. Even the children, their faces twisted into masks of fury they'd learned from their parents, threw sharp stones that cut into her skin. They all called her a thief. The whole town believed she had stolen the gold. Not just some poke of dust, but the entire reserve. The treasure that paid the miners who tore the guts out of the earth. The gold that kept food on the tables and whiskey in the saloon. The gold that gave Sheriff Brody his swagger and his pride. Without it, Deadwood Ridge was a dead town walking. It would starve. It would wither and blow away like so much dust. So they turned their rage on Clara. A rage born of fear, not because a single one of them had seen her take it. No, they turned on her because of her blood, because of her name, because of her brother, Ethan Mayfield. The name was a curse in this town, a ghost story told to frighten children. Years ago, he'd been a notorious outlaw, a shadow who robbed stagecoaches and vanished into the desert with blood on his hands and a smile on his lips. He was a bad seed. And when he suddenly reappeared after all this time, a phantom slipping into town under a new moon, and was seen whispering with Clara for just a moment behind the livery stable, the town decided the case was closed. It was all the proof they needed. If the wolf was back, then his sister must be running with the pack. They tied her wrists with coarse rope, pulling it so tight her skin split and bled. They dragged her out to the edge of the prairie, where the sun had baked the life out of the grass, leaving it dry and yellow, and there, with shovels and sweat and the sheer force of their hatred, they dug a pit. It wasn't a grave. It was a judgment. Sheriff Brody, his face red and sweating under the noon sun, shouted her sentence to the howling mob. This was her punishment. There would be no trial. There would be no mercy. She would be buried alive. A warning to anyone who dared cross Deadwood Ridge. A monument of flesh and bone to their fear. The crowd roared. The first shovelful of dirt hit her legs, cold and heavy. She screamed that she was innocent, that she'd done nothing, but her voice was a tiny thing, lost in the storm of their laughter and their curses. Someone lunged forward and struck her across the cheek with the back of a hand. A fresh bruise bloomed purple on her skin. Another grabbed a fistful of her hair and shoved her head down into the rising dirt. "Liars don't deserve to breathe," they hissed. Clara's eyes, wild with terror, darted from face to face. She searched for just 1 ounce of pity, one old friend, one neighbor, even a stranger with enough courage to speak. She found nothing. Only empty eyes and mouths twisted with hate. She tasted her own blood on her tongue. The sun burned her bare shoulders. Every handful of dirt felt like a stone, pressing her deeper into the earth, deeper into despair. She begged. She pleaded. She swore on her mother's grave that she had stolen nothing. But the harder she cried, the louder they mocked her. They wanted her tears. They wanted her fear. Finally, the sheriff lifted a hand. A grim silence fell over the prairie. He declared the town was now cleansed of its poison, and just like that, they turned their backs. They left her there, buried to her neck in the hard-packed earth, a living headstone on the empty plain. The vultures were already beginning to circle, dark specks in a merciless blue sky. The wind carried the sound of her sobs away until they were nothing. Her hands were twisted beneath the soil, helpless. The heat of the day scorched her skin, and the insects, drawn by the scent of her blood, began to crawl at her wounds. Every breath was a struggle. The weight of the world was crushing her lungs. Every second felt like her last. In that living grave, Clara thought of Ethan, her brother, The man who had brought this ruin upon her. Had he done it? Had he truly stolen the gold and left her to pay the price? Or was this something else? A trap laid by someone far cleverer, someone who was right now standing in the saloon, drinking a toast to their own genius? The people of Deadwood Ridge were sure she was guilty. But as the darkness began to creep into the corners of her vision, she had to wonder. Was she really the thief who had doomed this town? Or was she just the first victim of a secret so dark it had to be buried under a mountain of lies? The prairie went silent after the mob left. The only sounds Clara could hear were her own ragged breaths and the buzzing of flies. The sun was a hammer, beating down on her head. Her strength was draining out of her, pouring into the dirt that held her fast. She whispered one last prayer, a hopeless little thing she was certain no one would hear. But someone did. A shadow fell over her, long and dark against the parched ground. The sound of boots crunching on dry grass broke the silence. A man stood over her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a gray beard that spoke of long years and hard miles. A faded red scarf was knotted at his neck. Most folks in town figured Ezekiel Harper had hung up his gun for good. They figured wrong. Zeke squatted down, his knees cracking like dry twigs. He looked at Clara, really looked. Her eyes were swollen, nearly shut. Her cheeks were a mess of blood and dirt. But beneath the horror he saw something honest. Not the wild glare of a cornered thief, but the quiet, soul-deep desperation of someone being eaten alive by lies. He muttered to himself, a low growl that was half anger, half pity. Damn fools. Then, without another word, he started digging, with his bare hands. The dirt was packed as hard as stone, baked by the sun, but he clawed at it like a badger, tearing it away chunk by chunk. His nails cracked and split, but he didn't stop. Clara gasped as the pressure on her chest eased, and she could take a full, shuddering breath. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the soil, turning it to mud on her skin. "I didn't steal it," she whispered, her voice a raw croak. "I swear." Zeke just grunted. Figured as much. He worked until her arms were free, then her waist. Finally, he got his hands under her arms and hauled her out of the hole, laying her gently on the dry grass. She trembled like a newborn foal, too weak to even sit up. He uncorked his canteen and poured a little water over her cracked lips. Clara coughed, sputtered, then looked at him with wide, uncomprehending eyes. "They all think I did it," she rasped. "But I never touched that gold. It was my brother. They saw him with me. That's why." Zeke sat back on his heels, the setting sun turning the sky to blood behind him. He'd lived long enough to know how townsfolk thought. They didn't need truth. They just needed someone to blame. And Clara, with her outlaw brother, was the easiest choice. Still, it was more than that. Something in her voice, in her eyes, resonated with the gut feeling that had kept him alive through more gunfights and ambushes than he could count. He nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "Girl, if you're lying, I'll know soon enough. But if you're telling the truth, then somebody in that town is hiding a hell of a lot more than just gold." Clara clutched his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Will you help me? Please?" Zeke looked toward the distant rooftops of Deadwood Ridge. He knew what walking back into that town with her would mean. It would be like kicking a hornet's nest. He was old. He was tired. He'd had his fill of trouble. But something inside him, that old gunslinger's pride, maybe, or just the simple decency of a man who couldn't stand by and watch a murder, refused to let him walk away. He wouldn't let her die for a crime she didn't commit. He helped her to her feet, her body swaying against his. "Come on! If we're going to clear your name, we best get started." But what Zeke didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that the secret they were about to uncover wasn't just about stolen gold. It was a cancer that had been growing in the heart of Deadwood Ridge for years. and the man they were about to face had more power than either of them could imagine. And someone else, a ghost from the past, was already waiting in the shadows, watching their every move. Clara leaned on Zeke like he was the only solid thing in a world that had tried to swallow her whole. Every step back towards Deadwood Ridge was agony. Her legs shook and her face was a mask of dirt and bruises, a testament to the town's fury. When they reached the edge of Main Street, people stopped dead. Jaws dropped, eyes widened. It was as if they were seeing a ghost they themselves had made. Zeke kept one hand resting near the worn grip of his revolver. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The townsfolk parted before them like water around a stone, their whispers following them like buzzing flies. Clara held her head as high as she could. Her voice was weak, but it carried in the sudden silence. "I stole nothing." Sheriff Brody came storming out of his office, his face turning a blotchy purple. "She was judged, Harper. Her punishment was carried out. You had no right." Zeke's eyes narrowed to slits. "I had every right to stop a murder. You call that justice? I call it a lynching, and I've seen enough of those to know one when I smell it." His voice was low, but it cut through the sheriff's bluster like a knife. It carried the weight of a man who had spilled blood for reasons both good and bad, and knew the difference. A few of the miners shuffled their feet, looking uncomfortable. They remembered the stories about Zeke Harper. They knew his reputation wasn't just talk. He had faced down entire gangs and been the only one to walk away. And now, that same man was standing for Clara Mayfield. Clara took a shaky step forward, drawing on a strength she didn't know she had. "It wasn't me," she said, her voice gaining power. "My brother came back. Yes, you saw him with me. But he didn't give me any gold. He didn't give me anything. Someone else took it. Someone powerful. Someone who could point a finger at me and make you all believe it." The crowd stirred. A nervous energy rippled through them. They all knew who held the real power in Deadwood Ridge. It wasn't the sheriff. It was Hank Doyle, the saloon owner. The man who loaned money at rates that broke men's backs. The man who bought up land for pennies on the dollar. The man who whispered in the sheriff's ear and pulled the strings that made the whole town dance. But no one ever dared say his name. Until now. Zeke's gaze swept over the crowd, meeting every eye. "You all want the truth? Then give her a chance to prove it. If she's lying, I'll put the rope around her neck myself. But if she's telling the truth, then you're about to find out who the real thief is." The silence was thick enough to choke on. Then a single voice cut through it. An old miner, his face covered in coal dust. "Let the girl speak. Let Harper stand for her." A few others nodded, then a few more. The tide was turning. The sheriff clenched his jaw, trapped. He couldn't fight the whole town, not without looking like Doyle's puppet. For the first time since this nightmare began, a flicker of hope ignited in Clara's chest. Someone was listening. She glanced at Zeke, and he gave her the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. It was everything. But this was only the beginning. Hank Doyle wasn't a man who gave up power easily. And he had secrets buried deeper than any grave. Secrets he would kill to protect. As Zeke and Clara prepared to walk into that saloon, they had no idea they were walking into a trap that had been set years before they even arrived. The shadows of the past were about to step out with guns in their hands. The saloon was a wall of noise and smoke. Lanterns cast a greasy yellow light over the packed room. Zeke pushed the doors open, and a hush fell over the crowd. He led Clara inside, his hand never straying far from the Colt at his hip. Every card game stopped. Every conversation died. The piano player's hands froze over the keys. At the far end of the room, Hank Doyle leaned against his polished bar, a smug grin plastered on his face. His silk vest was too fine for a dusty town like this, and a heavy gold watch chain was draped across his chest. He raised his whiskey glass in a mocking toast. Well, well, the dead girl walks, and old Zeke Harper still trying to play the hero. Some things never change. Clara's stomach twisted into a knot, but she stood her ground. You set me up, she said, her voice clear and strong. You stole the town's gold and you used my brother to put the blame on me. The room buzzed with murmurs. Doyle's grin never wavered. Pretty words from a thief's sister. You've got no proof. You expect anyone here to believe you over me? Zeke stepped forward, his presence filling the space. I believe her, and I've seen enough liars in my day to fill a graveyard. You had the motive, Doyle. You had the access. And you had the most to gain from turning this town against an innocent girl. Near the door, Sheriff Brody shifted his weight, his hand hovering over his own gun, but he said nothing. It was no secret that Doyle lined his pockets, but fear was a powerful currency, and Doyle owned all of it. Doyle's smile finally faded, replaced by a look as cold as stone. You've got nothing, Harper. Just the word of a half-dead girl, and an old gunfighter who should have stayed retired. He tapped his glass on the bar for emphasis. This town belongs to me, and anyone who says different ends up in the ground. It was then that the saloon doors swung open with a deafening bang. A tall figure stood silhouetted against the night. His hat was pulled low, his long coat covered in the dust of the trail. The room went dead silent. Clara's breath caught in her throat. It was Ethan. He strode into the room, his eyes locked on Hank Doyle. He didn't say a word. He just moved, a blur of deadly grace. His revolver appeared in his hand as if by magic. The shot cracked like a whip, echoing off the walls. Hank Doyle staggered back, his eyes wide with a comical look of surprise. A dark stain blossomed on his fancy vest. He looked down at it, then back up at Ethan, then collapsed to the floor in a heap. Blood began to spread across the wooden planks. The silence was broken by a collective gasp. Ethan turned his cold eyes on the stunned crowd. I ain't no saint, he said, his voice a low rasp. But my sister is innocent. Doyle framed her, and you all followed him like sheep to the slaughter. His gaze found Clara's for a single fleeting moment, and in that moment she saw not the outlaw, but the brother she remembered from years ago. Then the hardness returned. He shoved the smoking pistol back into its holster, turned, and walked out into the night, vanishing as quickly as he had appeared. The saloon exploded into chaos. The spell was broken. Some shouted for the sheriff, others for a doctor. But one question burned in everyone's mind, hotter than the gunpowder smoke hanging in the air. If Hank Doyle had framed Clara to cover his tracks, then where was the gold? And what other secrets had he taken with him to the grave? The answer, when it came, would unravel not just a simple theft, but a conspiracy that would tear Deadwood Ridge apart at the seams. The chaos in the saloon was a firestorm. With Hank Doyle's body cooling on the floor, the fear he had cultivated for years died with him. The spell was broken. Led by the miners whose pay had vanished, the townsfolk tore the place apart. They ripped up floorboards, smashed barrels, and searched every dark corner from the cellar to the rafters. It didn't take long. A shout came from below. There, in the damp, dark cellar, hidden behind a false wall, were the sacks. Heavy canvas bags filled with gold dust and coins. The town's missing fortune. The proof was undeniable. Clara Mayfield had been innocent all along. When she and Zeke stepped back out onto the street, the air was different. The same people who had thrown stones and spat at her now stood silent, their heads bowed. Shame was a heavy blanket smothering the town. An old woman, the one who had screamed the loudest, stepped forward and whispered, "We were wrong." A miner took off his hat. "Forgive us, Clara." Clara's voice, though quiet, cut through the silence. "I never wanted your gold," she said, her eyes sweeping over their faces. "I just wanted to live without being afraid." Zeke placed a hand on her shoulder, his presence a silent anchor. "This girl was nearly buried alive because you were scared," he said, his voice a low rumble of judgment. "You listened to lies because it was easier than finding the truth. Remember this day. Remember how close you came to murdering one of your own." The crowd flinched. The lesson had been learned in blood. But as Zeke and Clara stood there, they both knew this wasn't the whole story. It was too simple, too neat. Doyle was a greedy man, but was he smart enough to pull this off alone? And Ethan, why would he risk coming back, risk hanging, just to shoot one man and disappear? Something still didn't fit. That night, Zeke took Clara back to his small cabin on the edge of town. As he was cleaning the last of the grime from a cut on her arm, his fingers brushed against a lump in the hem of her tattered dress. It was a small, hard object, expertly sewn into the fabric. He carefully cut the stitches. Lying in his palm was a small, strangely shaped piece of metal. It looked like a key, but for a lock he'd never seen before. Clara stared at it. "What is it?" "I don't know," Zeke said, turning it over in the lamplight. "Did your brother give this to you?" She thought back to that hurried, whispered conversation behind the livery. Ethan had grabbed her hands, his eyes wild. He'd said, "They're going to use you, Clara. Don't let them. The key is in the promise our mother made." It hadn't made any sense. She thought he was delirious. But he had squeezed her right hand, hard, where the key was hidden in her sleeve. She told Zeke. He frowned. "The key is in the promise." He looked from the key to Clara. "What promise did your mother make?" "She promised she'd always keep us safe," Clara whispered. "She had a small lockbox where she kept our birth certificates, a few heirlooms. She called it her safety box." Zeke's eyes lit up. "Where is it?" "It was sold with all our other things after she passed. Hank Doyle bought everything." Suddenly, the pieces started to click into place, forming a picture far more terrifying than a simple robbery. This wasn't just about stolen gold. The gold was a distraction, a magic trick to make everyone look one way while the real crime happened somewhere else. And this strange little key was the first step to uncovering it. But as they stared at the key, a floorboard creaked on the cabin's porch. Zeke blew out the lamp in an instant, plunging the room into darkness. He drew his Colt, his body tense. They weren't alone. Someone had followed them. Someone knew they had found the key. The hunt wasn't over. It had just begun. Silence pressed in on them in the dark cabin. Zeke moved like a cat, silent and low, to the window. He peered through a crack in the shutter. Two shadows were moving near the tree line. They weren't clumsy townsfolk. They moved with a purpose, a hunter's patience. "We can't stay here," he whispered, his voice urgent. "They know." "Know what?" Clara breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. "That we've got something that Doyle wanted hidden," Zeke said. He grabbed an old saddlebag and shoved the strange key inside, along with a box of cartridges and a stale biscuit. "There's only one place to go where they won't expect us." "Where?" "Straight back into the snake pit." They slipped out the back of the cabin and into the woods, the two men at the front none the wiser. Zeke led them on a long, winding path that brought them to the back of Main Street, shrouded in darkness. The saloon was quiet now, its doors barred, a place of death. But their target wasn't the saloon. It was the sheriff's office next door. "If Doyle was running a game this big, the sheriff had to be in on it," Zeke explained in a hushed tone. "Brody isn't smart, but he's greedy, and greedy men keep records." The lock on the back door was old and weak. Zeke had it open in seconds. Inside, the office smelled of stale cigar smoke and fear. A single moonbeam cut across the room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. While Clara stood watch, Zeke began to search. He didn't look in the obvious places. He ran his hands along the underside of the desk, tapped the floorboards, and checked behind a loose brick in the hearth. There, tucked into the dusty space, was a thin, leather-bound ledger. He opened it on the desk. It wasn't about gold. The entries were dates, names, and numbers. Names of miners, good men, many of whom Clara knew. Next to each name was a date, and then the words, contract terminated. And a number, a payout. But the payouts weren't to the miners. They were to Sheriff Brody, signed at the bottom of each page by Hank Doyle. They weren't just stealing the gold, Zeke breathed, his face grim in the moonlight. They were stealing the whole mine. Clara looked over his shoulder, her blood running cold. What does it mean, contract terminated? Before Zeke could answer, the front door of the office swung open. Sheriff Brody stood there, a shotgun held steady in his hands. But he wasn't alone. Behind him were three of the town's most respected men, the banker, the blacksmith, and the old preacher, the very men who had condemned Clara with righteous fury. "Looking for something, Harper?" the sheriff said, a cruel smile on his face. It wasn't a trap they had walked into. The whole town was the trap. The banker, Mr. Abernathy, stepped forward. "Doyle was a necessary evil, Zeke. He kept this town running. He made us all prosperous." "By killing miners and taking their claims?" Zeke shot back, his hand hovering over his pistol. "They were drifters. Nobodies," the blacksmith sneered. "Contract terminated," was Doyle's little joke. "It means they were put in the ground and their claims became part of our little partnership." The truth was a punch to the gut. The missing gold reserve was a lie, a smokescreen. The real scheme was murder. Doyle, the sheriff, and the town elders were systematically killing off miners who struck it rich, absorbing their claims, and growing wealthy on the blood of forgotten men. Clara was chosen as the scapegoat because her brother's reputation made the story believable. They were going to bury her and the truth right along with her. "And you were next on the list, old man," the sheriff said to Zeke. "You've been asking too many questions for years. Killing the girl was just a good way to draw you out." Clara saw it then. The ledger in Zeke's hand, the shotgun in Brody's. There was no way out. They had uncovered the heart of the conspiracy, only to be devoured by it. In that split second of despair, she acted. She grabbed the heavy inkwell from the desk and hurled it at the lantern hanging by the door. Glass shattered. Kerosene splashed across the wall and the room erupted in flames. The sheriff roared in surprise. The preacher screamed as a lick of fire caught his coat. In the chaos, Zeke shoved the ledger into his saddlebag, grabbed Clara, and dove through the back window, shattering the glass. They landed hard in the alley outside. A shot from the shotgun splintered the window frame where their heads had been. Zeke was hurt. A piece of flying glass had opened a deep gash in his side. He leaned against the wall, breathing heavily, as the sounds of shouting grew louder. The whole town was waking up. "Go," he grunted, pushing the saddlebag with the ledger and the key into her hands. "Get to the old Mission Pass. Follow the creek. Don't stop." "I'm not leaving you," Clara cried, trying to help him up. "You have to," he insisted, his voice strained with pain. "The truth is in that bag. It's the only thing that matters now. Go!" The sounds of the posse were getting closer. Dogs were barking. Men were shouting her name. They were trapped. Zeke was bleeding out, and an entire town of murderers was closing in. Just as the first figures appeared at the end of the alley, a shadow dropped from the roof above them. It landed silently like a panther. Before Clara could even scream, a familiar cold voice cut through the night. "Looks like you're in a spot of trouble, little sister." It was Ethan. He wasn't smiling. His face was a hard mask, his eyes scanning the alley, taking in Zeke's wound, the approaching mob, and the saddlebag clutched in Clara's hands. He moved with an unnerving calm, as if this was just another Tuesday. "Get him up," he ordered, pulling two massive revolvers. "Now." Clara, jolted out of her shock, helped Zeke to his feet. He swayed, leaning heavily on her, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. Ethan didn't wait. He fired 2 shots into the dirt at the feet of the approaching men, sending them scattering for cover. It wasn't a warning, it was a statement. "There are tunnels," he said, his back to them as he watched the mouth of the alley. "Under the old assay office. Used 'em back in the day to move stolen goods. Now we use 'em to get out." He led them through a maze of back alleys to a dilapidated building with boarded-up windows. A loose section of floorboards inside revealed a dark, cobweb-filled hole. The tunnels were cramped and smelled of damp earth and decay. Above them they could hear the town erupting, the sounds of the hunt growing more frantic. Ethan didn't speak again until they were deep underground, the sounds of the posse fading behind them. He lit a small lantern, its light throwing long, dancing shadows against the tunnel walls. He finally looked at Zeke's wound. "He won't make it to the pass," he said flatly. "But there's an old abandoned mine up in the hills. We can hole up there. For now." The climb to the mine was brutal. Clara and Ethan practically carried Zeke, who was fading in and out of consciousness. They found the mine entrance hidden behind a curtain of overgrown vines. Inside, Ethan laid Zeke down on a pile of old blankets and went to work on the wound with a bottle of whiskey and a knife heated in the lantern's flame. Zeke screamed, a raw animal sound that echoed in the cavern. When it was done and Zeke was passed out from the pain and whiskey, Ethan finally turned to Clara. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice low. "They were going to kill me," she shot back. "They buried me alive. What was I supposed to do?" "You were supposed to run," he said, his eyes hard. "When I told you to leave, you should have listened." He snatched the saddlebag from her and pulled out the ledger and the strange key. He stared at the key for a long moment. "I thought this was lost," he murmured. "What is it, Ethan? What's really going on?" Clara demanded. "It's not about stolen gold, is it?" Ethan let out a long, tired sigh. "No, it was never about the gold. That was just a story Doyle cooked up." He opened the ledger, his finger tracing the names of the dead miners. "This town, it runs on a river of blood. Doyle, Brody, the elders. They're partners. When a miner strikes a rich vein, they don't get to cash it in. They get a bullet in the back of the head. Their claim gets absorbed into the partnership. The gold keeps flowing and no one is the wiser." "And the town's gold reserve?" Clara asked. "Never existed," Ethan said with a bitter laugh. "It was a ghost story. A lie to keep the miners hoping, to keep them digging. Doyle and his partners were skimming everything, but an inspector, a real one from the territorial government, was scheduled to visit. They panicked. They needed a reason for the vault to be empty. They needed a thief." "Me," Clara whispered. "You," he confirmed. "My return was a gift from God for them. The outlaw's sister. The story wrote itself. I came back to warn you, to get you out before they put the noose around your neck." "I never thought they'd move so fast." He held up the key. "This is the real prize. It doesn't open a safety deposit box. It opens a secret compartment in the main vault at the assay office. That's where Doyle kept the real ledger, the one that details everything. The real output of the mines, the names of every man they murdered, the payouts to every partner. It's his confession, his life insurance." Now Clara understood. The sheer scale of the evil was staggering. The entire town was built on a foundation of lies and bones. "So, what do we do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan looked from the key to the ledger, to the unconscious form of Zeke Harper. A slow, cold smile spread across his face, a smile that reminded Clara of the outlaw he was famed to be. "They started a fire," he said. "Now we're going to burn their whole rotten town to the ground." Zeke was weak, but he was alive. Delirious with fever, he kept muttering about justice, about the faces of the men who had betrayed him. While Clara tended to him, Ethan planned. He moved like a ghost, studying the town from the hills, watching the patrol patterns, learning their new routines. The town was on lockdown, a prison of its own making, hunting for the siblings who held their ruin in a saddlebag. The plan was simple and insane. "They're expecting us to run," Ethan explained, cleaning his revolvers by the low fire. "They're not expecting us to walk right back into the lion's den. Tomorrow night there's a big prayer meeting at the church. The whole town will be there, asking God to deliver them from the Mayfield curse. All our little partners, Brody, the banker, the blacksmith, all in one place." "And that's when we go for the assay office," Clara finished, understanding. "That's when you go," Ethan corrected. "You and Zeke. He knows the office. You have the key." "What about you?" A dangerous glint appeared in his eyes. "I'll be creating a distraction, something they can't ignore." The next night, as the church bells rang, a new kind of hell broke loose in Deadwood Ridge. It started with an explosion. Doyle's saloon, the monument to his greed, went up in a ball of fire that lit up the night sky. Panic erupted. The prayer meeting scattered, men shouting and running towards the blaze. In the confusion, Clara, her face hidden by a shawl, helped a staggering Zeke through the darkened streets. He was pale and sweating, but his eyes were clear with a cold resolve. They reached the assay office. The front door was thick oak, but the lock was no match for Zeke's experience. They slipped inside. The main vault was at the back, a massive steel door with a complex tumbler lock. "There," Zeke whispered, pointing to a small, almost invisible keyhole just beside the main dial. "The failsafe." Doyle was always a paranoid man. Clara's hand trembled as she inserted the strange key. It fit perfectly. With a soft click, a small panel on the face of the vault sprang open. Inside was another ledger. This one was thicker, bound in black leather. She opened it. It was all there, page after page of meticulous records. The true weight of the gold pulled from the hills, the real profits, and a list. A list of names with the word terminated next to each one. It was the smoking gun. She had just pulled it out when the door to the office creaked open. Her heart leaped into her throat. But it wasn't the sheriff. It was the preacher, his face pale and sweating, not from the fire but from fear. "I knew you'd come here," he stammered. "You have to listen. I want it out. I told them the killing has to stop, but Doyle, he had something on all of us." He looked past Clara to the vault. "The evidence? It's not just in the book. He kept trophies." He reached into the secret compartment and pulled out a small cloth bag. He emptied it onto the desk. A dozen tin stars, the kind worn by deputy sheriffs, clattered onto the wood. Each was tarnished with rust-colored stains. "These belong to the territorial marshals," the preacher whispered, his voice cracking. "They sent 4 of them over the years investigating the disappearances. They never left Deadwood Ridge." It was a new, horrifying layer. They hadn't just killed miners, they had murdered lawmen. This wasn't just a town conspiracy anymore. This was an act of rebellion against the entire territory. Suddenly, the front of the building exploded inward. Sheriff Brody and a dozen deputized townsfolk stormed in, rifles raised. They'd been waiting. The fire at the saloon was just the first part of the trap. "Drop the book, girl!" Brody snarled, his eyes wild. "It's over!" They were surrounded. Zeke was too weak to even raise his gun. Clara clutched the ledger to her chest. This was the end. They had the truth, but they were going to be buried with it. But then a new sound cut through the tense standoff, a sound that didn't belong. It was the sound of singing, a chorus of rough, powerful male voices growing closer and closer. Brody's head snapped towards the door. The singing grew louder, a grim, determined hymn. Through the shattered doorway, they could see them, dozens of them, marching up the street, their faces illuminated by the flames of the burning saloon. The miners. They were carrying pickaxes and sledgehammers, their tools of the trade now turned into weapons. At their head, walking with a confident swagger, was Ethan. The fire at the saloon wasn't a distraction, it was a signal. While the town's leaders were hunting Clara, Ethan had gone to the mining camps. He hadn't just shown them proof, he had given them a voice for their rage. He had turned an army of victims into an army of vengeance. The miners surrounded the assay office, their faces hard and unforgiving in the firelight. Sheriff Brody and his men looked at the ledger in Clara's hands, then at the sea of angry faces outside. The trap had snapped shut, but not on the prey they had been expecting. The standoff in the assay office was a frozen moment in time. Sheriff Brody and his men, trapped between the evidence of their crimes and the army of miners waiting outside. The miners didn't shout, they just stood there, a silent, menacing wall of judgment. Their silence was more terrifying than any threat. Then one of the deputies, a young man who had always looked at Clara with kind eyes, lowered his rifle. He dropped it on the floor with a clatter. "No more," he said, looking at Brody with disgust. "I ain't dying for you." That broke the spell. The other deputies, simple townsfolk caught in the web, threw down their guns. It was over. Brody and the preacher stood alone, their faces ashen. Ethan stepped through the door, a cold smile on his lips. He walked over to Clara, took the black ledger from her hands, and held it up for Brody to see. "Looks like your books are a little out of balance, Sheriff." The miners surged forward. They dragged Brody, the preacher, the banker, and the blacksmith out into the street. The justice of Deadwood Ridge was swift and brutal. There were no trials. There was no mercy. Just the rough justice of the frontier, delivered at the end of a rope thrown over the branch of a sturdy oak tree. In the midst of the chaos, Clara saw a figure trying to slip away from the crowd. The banker's wife, a woman who had always dripped with jewels and scorn. Clara pointed. "She knew. She spent the blood money." The crowd turned, and the woman's escape was cut short. No one who had profited from the town's dark secret was spared. When the sun rose, it was over a different town, a town cleansed by fire and fury. Ethan found Clara standing near the smoldering ruins of the saloon. Zeke was with her, patched up by the miners, looking tired but alive. "I have to go," Ethan said. "The law will still want me for things I did a long time ago. This town, it deserves a fresh start, without ghosts like me." He looked at his sister, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of peace in his eyes. "You were always the strong one, Clara. I just brought the storm. You showed them how to rebuild." He placed a hand on her shoulder, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the morning mist, without a backward glance. In the weeks that followed, Clara Mayfield was no longer the outcast. She was the town's conscience. With Zeke at her side, she helped organize the miners. They took the black ledger, the real one, and used it to return the stolen claims to the families of the men who had been murdered. The gold in Doyle's cellar became the seed of a new town bank, one owned by all the citizens, not just one greedy man. They didn't bury the past. They confronted it. They erected a monument in the center of town with the name of every miner who had been killed. A stark reminder of the price of greed and silence. Months later, Clara and Zeke stood on the edge of the prairie at the very spot where she had been buried alive. The hole was long since filled in, and new grass was starting to grow. They looked back at Deadwood Ridge. It was still scarred, still healing, but it was alive, and it was honest, for the first time. "He was right," Clara said quietly. "He brought the storm." Zeke nodded, looking at the determined set of her jaw, the strength in her eyes. "Yeah," he said, a small smile touching his lips. "But you're the one who taught them how to stand in the rain." The truth has a funny way of clawing itself out of the dirt, no matter how deep you try to bury it. And sometimes it just takes one person refusing to stay buried to change everything. What would you have done if you were one of those miners and you found out you'd been cheated and your friends had been murdered? Could you have delivered that same harsh justice? Let me know what you think down in the comments. And if this story of survival and justice out on the raw frontier got your heart pounding, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the next tale we dig up, because out here, every sunset carries a story.